All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Christian Blockwood. I'm the president and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration. I'm honored to welcome you here today for the Extreme Weather Resilience Hub event here in Washington, D.C. The Academy is a nonpartisan, a congressionally chartered organization that helps leaders build more effective, efficient, transparent, and accountable organizations. Today, we're gathered here at a pivotal time where communities are facing nationwide and increasingly urgent, complex challenges around extreme weather events. The frequency and the impact of these events are suggesting that we need to quickly adapt to them, and you'll hear a lot more about that today. Traditional governance models that we've used to address these issues they're not enough. We need to deploy more innovative methods, different and new governance structures, and we need to think about different partnerships. This afternoon, we're honored to bring a panel together. Experts and their leadership spans the private sector, professional associations, and government, and you'll hear a lot of good insight and remarks from them. And they'll talk more about not just their own experiences and what they've done, but also share more insights about how to address some of the adaptation challenges around extreme weather. I invite you all to fully engage, and so there'll be opportunities to ask questions, not just listen, share your ideas, and also build connections with one another. I mean, that's how we're going to strengthen communities. So let's use this opportunity today to forge new partnerships, new ideas, and action-oriented solutions to help us address some of these challenges for now, but also into the future. And I wanted to just thank our experts for their time. I know that that's really precious these days, and thank all of you for joining us in the room and for those who are joining online. So I'll now turn it over to Dr. Lou Uccellini, a distinguished Academy Fellow and former Director of the National Weather Service, and he'll share brief remarks that'll talk a little bit more about the conversation we're going to have today. Sir.
So thanks, everyone, and good afternoon. I'll try to be brief. This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, actually. But it's wonderful, actually, to join you in this discussion of this hub concept, the Extreme Weather Resilience Hub, a space that brings us together, and not just folks from a policy point of view, but a number of academics and people who've worked in the federal government and at the state level, working together to attempt to connect weather and water information to building a more resilient nation. And we also have to account for the fact that these events are getting more extreme. They are related to solid science. Atmosphere gets warmer, more water vapor, more energy, more intense storms. So we should not be overly surprised about it, since the climate science community has been saying this for over 25 years. So that's where we are today. Throughout my career within NASA and then NOAA, and eventually as the leader of the National Weather Service, I've witnessed how extreme weather and water events have devastated communities. And I'm proud to have been part of the Weather Ready Nation effort involving delivery of impact-based decision support services that connected us with emergency managers. This plan came about in the 2010-2011 timeframe and was reviewed by NAPA. That was my first introduction to NAPA. And Amanda was on that review team. I recognized her when I came in. I said, "You are on that review team." It was one of the best reviews, actually, that I've ever gotten in any organization. I actually use it as a blueprint for moving the weather service forward. So she still got a hook in me, and she made sure I was here today. This was a success because it pulled the meteorological and emergency management community together at every government level. And there's reasons why that worked. Everybody recognized that, for example, that the local emergency managers were the ones who made the decisions on the ground. And the rest of us were there to support them. And once that came together, moving forward, nothing is easy in life, but there are a lot of people within NAPA and other review teams that were amazed that we were able to pull it off rather quickly. So the notional thing was that every community would be ready for and be able to respond to an oncoming extreme event. And if you notice with hurricanes, which was a real focus, for a number of the storms, the emergency management community behind the scenes was working 10 days before landfall rather than responding to a storm like Andrew and not knowing what to do even 2 or 3 days after the event happened. So that's sort of a measure of success. And I think it is a success story in terms of people and the federal, state, and local agencies coming together to mitigate the impact of these storms. Nevertheless, we are seeing changes that are making me realize, anyway, because I thought Weather Ready Nation, from a mitigation perspective, could morph over to a climate resilient activity from an adaptation perspective, that that I thought would be a doable thing. I'm not convinced that that's true today, even putting what's going on at the federal level on the side. But the federal government seems to be doing everything possible to not only make attaining a Weather Ready Nation harder to accomplish, but also seemingly stepping away from any notion of adaptation and perhaps the hub strategy entirely. So I have two basic concerns. One is from a meteorological perspective and a social science perspective, because to get people to respond to an oncoming event, they have to go through a changing risk preference. They have to be willing to react to an event. And that's hard enough to do. And any local emergency manager will tell you, trying to get people to leave their own house before an oncoming hurricane is one of the hardest things they have to do. And they can't make the people leave. It's their decision. Well, throw on top of that, you're predicting an event that nobody's ever seen before. And you're asking them, and you're against this wave when you're making those kind of predictions of people on social media saying, oh, the weather community is overhyping the event. So you got these two events going on. Let me give you some examples. New York City, 2021, Ida, a remnant storm. There was a storm 2 weeks before that set a rainfall rate record of 2 inches an hour, which broke a long-standing record that goes back to the original, but over a limited area. Ida hit 4 inches per hour. And it's the first time that kind of rainfall actually necessitated a flash flood emergency for all 5 boroughs. And the first responders basically stood and watched, and quotes, there were quotes that come from this, the world changed before their eyes. There was nothing they could do. The infrastructure was failing, the drains didn't have the capacity to handle the water. And a number of people died that were in basement apartments. So why didn't you tell us we were going to get 4 inches an hour? So what we see now is if you're trying to forecast that extreme kind of event, you want to walk up to it. And I will get to the Texas eventually with this, but if you go right to the extreme event, people just, well, that's never happened here. Okay. So we're up against that. All right. So Helene, Asheville's a little bit different because they've had previous floods, but they rebuilt their infrastructure. They rebuilt their roads, drainage, a lot of things. And they were absolutely confident with the rainfall being predicted that those building projects would hold. They actually they just got to the front end of Helene because the earlier precipitation, the day before precipitation, actually created enough concern that some of these roads were being overtopped already. And they had rainfall rates there for Helene that had never been observed before, on top of the rainfall that they had the day before. And I don't know if people have seen the picture of the lake, Luna, I think it is. Laura. Just splinters, wood splinters covering the entire lake and a boat sitting on top of it. All right. Now, if you could have pictured that happening, I'm sure people would have reacted, but You know, that's never happened before. It's like an inland tsunami. And we saw this in Tennessee in 2021, southwest of Nashville. When I saw the damage from this train of thunderstorms, that had like 10 inches of rain southwest of Nashville, the houses were splinters. It looked like the Mississippi coast after Katrina. Okay, so this is what you're asking people to respond to. Okay, and it's not an easy task. The LA fires, there was statements made about the not long enough lead time for the forecast, the watches, the warnings. I just went and reviewed the initial report on that. They were talking about that for 4 or 5 days in advance. Now, were they predicting the extremity of the fire that actually occurred? Were they predicting 100-mile-an-hour winds, hurricane force winds, with the Chinook that happened? Okay, no, they were predicting strong winds, but these 100-mile-an-hour, 100-mile-an-hour plus winds was a result of the developing fires as much as it was the normal dynamics that would create that kind of wind flow when you get that east to west wind over the mountains. How do you get everybody to evacuate? Now, after the Paradise Fire, there are regions up in Central California that people do respond because they realized there was one of the problems with Paradise is that the fire people had to stop fighting the fire to evacuate the people because the fire was moving faster. And that's the whole thing about fires now. They burn hotter and they move faster. You can't wait see it coming over the hill to start evacuating people. You have to do it 2-3 days in advance. And people are reluctant to do that. Okay, so you have those kind of challenges. Now, and then there's Texas, and this is really the first time I'm talking about it. I actually woke up on the 4th of July morning, and the very first thing I heard on the news, first I heard about the flood, and then the second part of the story, there was a senior administrator from the state emergency management community throwing the weather service under the bus. And the weather service didn't forecast this soon enough, right? We didn't have a chance to get ready for it, kind of thing. And I said to myself, right then and there, the impact-based decision support services has failed in this case. And the reason is, when it works, nobody throws anybody under the bus on either side of that transom. This was a tough forecast problem, but still, 36 hours before, people were pointing to the potential of flash floods in a flash flood prone area and up the game every step of the way. The end of July 2nd, July 3rd, that should have worked, but there was clearly either a lack of connectivity between the weather service and the emergency managers or none. And that's what the investigation is trying to unravel. So there might be forecast issues, but there were problems on both sides. The weather services, we're authorized by law to provide IDSS through the WCM, the Warning Coordination Meteorologist. The 2 vacant positions in the 2 forecast offices for that read was the Warning Coordination Meteorologist. This is the person who sets up meetings, not the day before, 6 months, 5 months, 4 months, so you can practice. They weren't there. No local travel. You can't get people to go to those local meetings if they don't have a credit card that has more than $1 on it. Okay. It's not clear with respect to the emergency management community what was happening at the county level within the state. And I won't speak to that, but there was no connectivity despite the fact that the weather service tried calling starting at 1 o'clock in the morning. So there was time and there were others. So I think these are major challenges that we are facing with this whole hub concept. And I'm not sure exactly how to proceed other than to say focus at the state level, because that's at least where the coordination can still happen. But it's still at the local level, as we saw, even in Texas and California, in these heavy rain events that make the critical decisions. So if we're working towards increasing resiliency, it's got to be local to county to state. And I'm hoping that as we move down this pathway, we'll make sure that that connection is solid as it needs to be. Thank you.
So floods, fires, strong winds, there's no shortage of challenge, but there's also opportunity. And here to talk about both of those, challenge and opportunity, I'd like to invite up Amanda Mullen, who is one of the project directors here at the Academy. She's also the coordinator of the Extreme Weather Resilience Hub. And along with her efforts, the generosity of Academy Fellows, Mark and Jane Pisano, many other fellows and strategic partners, she is also responsible for us being able to launch the Extreme Weather Resilience Hub earlier this year. So Amanda, please come up. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Amanda Mullen, and I'm proud to be here with Alice Hill, who is the David Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council of Foreign Relations. She's an expert on the risks, consequences associated with climate change, and has served in many different roles, including the White House and the Department of Homeland Security. Pleased to have you here with us today to kick off this our DC launch of the Extreme Weather Resilience Hub.
Well, thank you. Delighted to be here.
So a lot has been going on since January of this year, and I don't think we fully know what's going to happen. Anybody who says that they might know probably shouldn't listen too hard to them. But we're in a shifting environment, and we know that our state and local folks are going to need some assistance. So, given your experience, historically, what has been the role of federal funding in climate resilience strategies, and then where do you see that evolving to go?
Well, first, let me say how pleased I am to be here. It really is my honor and pleasure. And it's exciting that you've launched this hub. I think timing is everything, and the timing is good because we're going to need a lot of help if the federal government does retreat in this area. You know, if you look at federal involvement, we had the big floods along the Mississippi in the 1930s, and that eventually propelled Herbert Hoover to the White House because he was in charge of the flood relief. And then in the 1950s, but it was kind of ad hoc how we responded to big disasters in the United States. It was maybe there'll be some federal help, maybe there'll be some state help, maybe there'll be philanthropy, but maybe religious groups, and then it fell on the individuals and the communities themselves. And then in 1950, we started seeing a formalized role for the federal government in disaster recovery and relief. And I think since 1950, we've seen a general explosion in the federal role. But what we're seeing now is, and if you read Project 2025, a push for a major rethink of that. And certainly, I don't think I've ever met anyone in disaster management who doesn't say we need reform. I mean, I think everyone recognizes that things could be improved, and that's probably true for any organization. There's always need for reform, but we certainly heard a lot of complaints, and we hear a lot of complaints because this is the worst moment in people's lives. They're going through a horrendous disaster, they've lost their home, and then the feds haven't arrived with the cavalry in the way they expected, and they're mad. And we've also created now, in my opinion, an expectation that because of this growth over time, we've seen other organizations somewhat atrophy in their response because the federal government was going to bring the cavalry. So there's an expectation of people. And now there's a push to rethink this. And certainly when I served in the Obama administration, Craig Fugate was pushing for let's push this onto the states. Let's have them step up more and find some incentives for them to do more. So I think there is a philosophical question here, and you could come out in a variety of ways. There's reasons why the federal government grew to be so significant, but there may be reasons why it should shrink. including perverse incentives, moral hazard, because the states weren't doing enough in this area. They were so dependent on the federal government. But for me, watching this, it's two things. It's the speed with which the change is occurring. So if anyone's worked in government, that's a shocking thing, and they're not ready to move on a dime and have everyone trained up and have all the resources in place and have all the agreements to respond adequately at the state level. So that's pretty shocking, I think, for them to have to figure out, how am I going to be the leader here when you've created, the federal government's created a position where they're often not, they're leader at the first response, but they're not leaders in a lot of other things. And so that is, I think, very difficult. And then you couple that with great uncertainty as to what is actually happening. There just isn't a lot of clarity right now as to where things will end up, because the Trump administration has changed its mind, changed how it approaches things, and then not a lot of clarity from Congress as to how they're going to do this. There will continue to be tremendous pressure on Congress for what Hank Paulson, the former Republican Secretary of the Treasury, called climate bailouts. We're going to have these big disasters. The states are going to be under-resourced, and there'll be a lot of pressure on Congress to come through. And I think you'll see even fiscal conservatives. This is a bipartisan problem, because what elected official do you know wants to say, yep, I'm a fiscal conservative, don't send any money to my voters. I really want to hold the line here. It's just really, and that's what Hank Paulson called out. It's politically suicide for them. So they're not going to do it. And Rand Paul, you saw, he didn't want to give money to Sandy, but when Kentucky gets really flooded, oh yeah, it's different. We want it. Ted Cruz, the same thing. We want the money. And that's just a politician's life. They are going to have to be responsive to their constituents. So you've got the uncertainty of the Trump administration, the speed with which they've announced they want to do things, and then you've got, what role is Congress going to, and are they going to bring some discipline to this? I don't know. One test would be with the NFIP. It's up for reauthorization. What's going to happen there? That's a program that desperately needs discipline. But it isn't FEMA, who oversees that program, that hasn't wanted discipline, based on my knowledge. It's Congress, because it's their voters in New Jersey and elsewhere who have subsidized insurance, who do not want to pay, their voters don't want to pay the true price of insurance. So we see some tests, and those tests will also be true. They've been tests for Democratic administrations, and there'll be tests for the Republican administration.
That's great context, Alice, for the conversation we're going to have. And I understand we're operating in a time of great uncertainty, but do you see there are any opportunities for states and local governments or other organizations to step in and play more of a role if the federal government has stepped away?
Sure. I mean, it's two sides of the coin. You know, as it's political. A political judgment. So the states could be much more leaders. They could have more say, less bureaucracy in how they're going to deal with what they choose to do. They could bring more innovation with less oversight from the federal government. They could create new partnerships to see how things would go. They could do more cross-jurisdictional planning. So lots of opportunities, but I think we have to also look at the challenge side, which are resources and capacity. I mean, because the federal government has done so much in this space, do they have the planners necessary to deal with, and to your point, to deal with events that have never been experienced in human memory? I'm not talking living memory. We're talking in recorded history. These events are bigger than anything anyone's really experienced. And that is very cognitively difficult for any of us to get around, because humans, how do we assess risk? we assess based on what our loved ones, our friends, people who are close to us have experienced. And that's why you get, oh, we don't need to evacuate. That's just not that big a deal. We never had that problem. And by the way, the last time they had us evacuate, nothing happened. So I'm not evacuating. And you're dealing against these cognitive or inability to imagine catastrophic risk beyond what we've experienced, which is by definition climate change. So I think that will be exacerbated at the state level since they're going to have no information about what their risks are. I mean, looks like we're not going to have the congressionally mandated national climate assessment. So Congress has said every 4 years, the federal government's supposed to produce a national climate assessment, which has improved every time it's been issued. And it covers sectors and regions and tells people what their risks are. And then NOAA also and USDA and others produce risk maps. I don't think we're going to have those for local communities. So what do they plan for? If they don't have the data, and that data for them to generate on an atmospheric problem is very difficult. They need very sophisticated modeling, and they can purchase that probably on the private sector. The modeling in the private sector, however, depends on the federal models. Then they specialize what they're offering based on those models. So if we don't have the federal models going, I don't know what they look to. It's really a challenge. So I think there's a role here with climate change that we can't afford to have the federal government step out of. I don't know. It looks like they are stepping out. We've had a lot of climate scientists leave. We've had them recruited to other nations, and we've had making it more difficult. I don't know if it's impossible, but more difficult to locate federal data, existing federal data. And I don't know what the plans are to create new analysis of the data. And that will leave all communities vulnerable, even the richest, because I think it will be even difficult for California or New York to recreate what the federal government is doing. If satellites come down, which is reported, they're going to, we're going to stop collecting data. How do we observe what's happening and then predict what will be in the future? So some big challenges.
Some big challenges. No one sector or level of government can address this challenge. And in examining the system as it was created and as you had explained, over time, the role of the federal government had gotten a lot larger. It also been very much focused on the initial response to the disaster and then the recovery itself, the shorter term recovery and then the longer term recovery. While I was at GAO, we did a review of the federal approach to disaster recovery, and what we had actually found was they were still spending money from Hurricane Katrina, and that was earlier this decade. So the recovery time was taking longer and longer. You're not seeing communities bounce back. Unfortunately, we've moved into a space where there's just so many things happening all the time. Even to reflect back to, as Louis mentioned, Hurricane Helene, it's been a year since that disaster. They are not fully recovered, and that's not the top news story, and that's really the challenge. So there's a lot going on where there might be some opportunities since the system wasn't working as well as it could have. We know that incentives for resilience and adaptation and the pre-disaster investments to try to build up capacity before the disaster happens seems like that's even more of a critical piece to the story. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we might shift the system as a whole during this time of uncertainty and federal devolution.
Well, this has been a conundrum for me ever since I started working on climate change. And that occurred because I was asked to join the Department of Homeland Security and draft the first adaptation plan for the Department of Homeland Security. And I'd been formerly a judge in Los Angeles and a prosecutor. And I didn't know a lot about climate change. So I was educated by NASA, NOAA, Navy, a meteorologist, scientists, and frankly, I had an aha moment. Wow, this affects everything, including Homeland Security and including its critical missions. So through that, I also learned that mitigation is probably, we need to cut our emissions, and I think that will help us avoid the worst of the disasters. So I'm going to put that aside. That we just have a given. There's a meme out there that we can adapt to these things. We can't really adapt to what's predicted. I mean, I just don't think human culture, there'll be places that are saved and people who are saved, but there'll be a lot of chaos and migration and other things. So it's better that we cut our emissions and try to control the level of harm that we're going to experience. But with that harm that we're going to experience, it was, I mean, I was involved with the NIBS study, the National Institute of Building Sciences study that FEMA helped pay for, that $1 spent is 5 to 6. You get to building codes, it's $11 return for, so you spend $1 on building something to a modern building code, you save $11 in damages. I mean, that is an incredible rate of return. And even the Chamber of Commerce, which is viewed as more conservative, estimates that a community will save $13 for every dollar they invest in resilience. So we know that works. This isn't like a big question mark whether we should do disaster risk reduction. We totally need to do it. But it's getting people, getting over that cognitive hump to having people want to choose to take money that might be in a limited resources world, that might be going to their school system or something else, and put it into risk reduction. It's a tough sell. And you have a lot of people saying, oh, that's going to affect the affordability of houses, for example, if you insist on building more resiliently. Yeah, probably in some instances will increase the cost of the house. I will quote Craig Fugate here, though. A house that collapses is not an affordable house. So let's be real that, you know, if the house fails, then that's not a particularly affordable house, and the person might be stuck with a mortgage and they don't have an asset. So that has been the biggest challenge. And one of the memes that I heard when I first, and I believed it, oh, we'll have these big events and people will begin to understand that they need to do this. But our memories are short when it comes to catastrophes. And then you're right, the people in the community are rebuilding, but you know, it's new people come in. And so I think that is a huge research question to figure out what would motivate people to want to take from this basket and put the dollar in this basket to save them from tremendous harm. And then when you add climate change in there, that's really hard because it's so politicized. I mean, it is.
Well, there's a lot of challenges that we've covered in this conversation.
There's
I'm
hope,
hopeful
though.
that
Yeah.
I'm going to pass this over to Eric Lecky to hopefully talk about some solutions.
Good. Take it away. Thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here, and for those joining us online, it's great to have you all. I think we've been set up for a good conversation here this afternoon. First by Louis' opening comments, and then Alice's chat here just a moment ago. I want to introduce our panel this afternoon. First and foremost, I'm Eric Lecky. I'm a fellow here at the National Academy of Public Administration. I do have my own consultancy as well, and I'm a former associate administrator for mission support at FEMA. Want to introduce my panel this afternoon. First, Derek Hebert. Derek is the Infrastructure Resilience Practice Leader at AECOM and was previously the Assistant Administrator for Hazard Mitigation at FEMA. Dan Neese, Director of Policy and Finance at Throw Environmental. And Garrett Ngoglia, Vice President of Haggerty Consulting. If you all want to join us. So we've been set up nicely here with a number of challenges, all challenges. We'll try to comb through some of the solutions. We'll go for about the next hour, but our plan then also for the last 15 minutes of that hour is to do some Q&A. So be thinking about what you might like to ask. The first couple of questions in our conversation is going to be focused on the current state of things with respect to the evolving changes in crisis and emergency management nationwide. So we'll pick up on Alice's comments in the Fireside chat and continue that conversation with the changes being discussed at a federal level. And so as of this event, we don't yet know what reform will look like, but there's a lot of discussion, a lot of views, and a lot of opinions. And so what are some things, and Derek, we'll start with you. What are some things for local and state officials to know as they monitor this administration's activities?
So first, so this is a really interesting, I think, challenge. I've seen a lot of conversations with state and local folks where they're guessing. They're saying, we don't know what to expect. And so I think a few grounding purpose points. First of all, the authorities have not actually changed. The underlying Stafford Act and related authorities are the same as they were. They haven't actually changed anything. The regulations have not been changed. And so at this very instant, until those changes happen, you need to be prepared to operate under the same reality that you did before. However, we should also know that there's change may be coming. And in fact, resilience is a pretty darn bipartisan thing. There is substantial willingness in Congress, for example, House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, with the FEMA Act, to come up with approaches to fix a lot of these problems. And if you read the FEMA Act, what you saw was a grab bag of everybody's problems from the last like 20 years in one bill. I mean, down to really nitpicky little things. What does that mean? That means if you aren't talking to your elected officials, you're not going to get heard. And so now's a great time to be doing that. Third, there's a substantial risk you're going to get authority without or responsibility without authority. That means you're going to have to implement the Stafford Act, but you're not going to get the top cover of FEMA. You're going to implement according to the administration's priorities, but you're not necessarily going to get to make decisions that you want to make about your programs. So be careful when you wish for a block grant in case it doesn't really come as like you think it will. So block grants come with oversights. And then finally, a shift in how funding works will require kind of a shift in the way your agency and organization approaches things. Right now, across this country, states think about recovery, for example, on a project-by-project basis. Locals think about recovery, unfortunately, on a project-by-project basis. How do you know this? Well, because everybody's focused. Okay, I got to close out this many projects. I want to make sure my small projects are formulated right. I want to make sure that I've got these activities, these actions done. It's a process-oriented, project-oriented process. But if you're going to own more of these programs, that means you've got to switch your mind into a program-oriented approach, which means you're focused primarily on outcomes and are evaluating all the stuff you have to do in line with those outcomes that you're trying to achieve. That's a really powerful and exciting thing, but it requires a different kind of organization. And so I would tell my state and local colleagues, you got to start thinking like that. And that's
great. Thanks, Derek. Garrett, I'm going to turn to you next and sort of following on Derek's comments. Given the changes at the federal level, both those that we think are coming and those that we can anticipate, how should local and state governments address and balance speed of recovery from disasters while also building climate resilience in their communities?
Well, my company, Haggerty Consulting, works with state and local governments across the country on the whole range of emergency management activities. And what we're seeing is a lot of confusion, a lot of concern, because the messaging from the administration has been confusing, to say the least. For example, the BRIC program, which many of you are familiar with, really the flagship pre-disaster mitigation program. For fiscal year 2024, there's no notice of funding opportunity. It has been announced that the program's terminated. So again, there's a lawsuit. There's a lot of different ways this could turn out. But for now, communities aren't getting their BRIC money, and it appears that unobligated funds will be swept back into the disaster relief fund. So that's a big deal for state and local governments. The hazard mitigation grant program, the FEMA's largest resilience program, basically the administration has said, well, we're not going to automatically authorize this after disasters, which was kind of the case in recent years, at least. So and we've seen that since, I think, March. Maybe there hasn't been an authorization of HMGP to communities. So that's another big deal. So we have state and local governments saying, okay, we have a pipeline of projects. We had a plan that we were going to get funding through these various mechanisms, and now we may not. And so we have state and local governments who are looking at this pipeline of projects and saying, okay, which ones are we going to move forward with, even with the risk that we may not get any federal funding for them? Which of these can we kind of scope down and maybe we can accomplish parts of what we plan to do? And which of these we're just going to have to leave, until later, or at least until there's more clarity about federal funding. So it's a difficult, tricky time. I think obviously tracking, available funding, grants.gov is your friend. There are still funding opportunities available coming out of the federal government that could improve resilience. And I think, taking advantage of those opportunities is important. On the kind of the bright side of things, I guess, is the fact that there was, the BRIC program has helped communities identify, maybe get some momentum behind some of these resilience projects and programs, that they can be moved forward when additional sources of funding are made available. And there's a lot of things that state and local governments can do in the absence of federal funding. Codes, establishing codes, enforcing codes, because just because you have codes, you have to actually enforce them to have the resilience effect you want. There's still funding available for pre-disaster preparedness activities that are not necessarily infrastructure related, emergency operations planning, educating communities and households about preparedness and risks and things like that. There's a lot they can do, but it definitely is a period of uncertainty, and I think there are going to be a lot of challenges and opportunities ahead.
Great. I want to do one follow-up here, Garrett, that
Yeah.
a lot of what we're talking about here is a discussion on a shift in roles and responsibilities, should they come to fruition. And the Academy Fellowship and many of our viewers and some of those in the room today are state and local officials. And so with this shift comes a need at the state level and at a local level to manage this, to project manage this, to make sure that the right infrastructure is in place. You can't just have an entire shift without a thought through process on how the state or locals can handle that and manage that. What are some recommendations you might have in thinking through that, on how they can begin thinking through capacity building and planning now, while not knowing exactly where this is going to go?
Yeah, it's definitely challenging, and we've been thinking about this and working with our clients on this, but it's hard to know what you're planning for because of all the uncertainty. But if we take, it looks like there's going to be a bit of a pullback by the federal government in terms of funding and management of resilience programs. There's going to be a pushing down of responsibility. So I think one thing that states can do I mentioned a few things that they have the ability to do, but I think it's important for states to, recognize that in the absence of federal government, they're going to have to take on some of those responsibilities. One of the big issues with, I think, mitigation and resilience programs in the past has been that disadvantaged communities have not been able to take advantage of some of these opportunities. And there have been programs established at the federal level to provide technical assistance and other help to those communities and to try to direct funding to those opportunities. But if states are given more responsibility for administering programs and giving more discretion in managing programs like that, the concern is that there are going to be communities that are left behind. So even in the current environment and in past years, you've seen some states take a very active role in helping the local governments to prepare applications for assistance and manage and implement projects. And I think the results, are good for those states, and other states that have taken more of a back seat have seen not as good results. So I think that's really important to keep in mind that that disadvantaged communities need support. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to identify additional funding mechanisms and opportunities, prioritizing projects, and being innovative in the way they secure funding in the potential absence of federal funding.
Great. Thanks, Garrett. Dan, I'm going to turn to you. In your view, what can local governments do to facilitate improved governance and financing design that will help them better address the challenges associated with adaptation to resilience from extreme weather events, especially in light of discussion, at least, about a federal pullback? Governance and financing is one of the noted and cited parts of the Extreme Weather Resilience Hub here at the Academy, and I think it'd be good to have a brief conversation about preparing for that.
Sure. Well, first, by definition, resilience is the capacity to respond in adverse conditions. And at the local level specifically, I'm thinking about those disasters that were talked about at the beginning of the event. My guess is you could have taken the entirety of the BRIC program and put it in New York City and still would not have been able to protect it from what happened in that storm. And it's probably best that we're having this conversation in this administration than the previous administration, because it was never the role of the federal government to really fund at scale climate resilience. It was a drop, excuse the pun, a drop in the bucket. By the way, I just want to say, somebody told me the other day when I described them what I do, he said, my experience with people who work on climate issues is that they have an impending sense of doom that sustains them through the good times. And that's kind of where we're at, right? So I think about 4 inches of rain in Asheville. There's just nothing from a governance standpoint that is going to stop that rain from happening and that lake to fill with the splinters. But I think so that's the first comment. So that just for the appropriate sense of doom about what we're looking at. The second thing, though, is that just as we should be anticipating, and it's hard to get people to think about these events when they haven't happened in recorded history, the assumption at the local and state level should be, this administration is not going to give you a penny. Now, they probably will give you money, but your assumption should be they won't, because that's good risk reduction. That's how you manage these crises. So when your assumption is you're only going to get an inch of rain and you get 4, you're in big trouble. So if your assumption is you're going to get this money from the federal government and you get none, you're in big trouble. So if it works out the other way, so now I'm saying all this and I'm not an expert on FEMA and the federal system, but I do a lot of work at the local level. And what we have seen is local governments relying way too much on the federal government, even before this administration, and not taking ownership of the issue that is uniquely local to them. And that's really hard to do when it relates to money. And the other reason why it's hard to do in this particular instance is it's an admission that the problem is bigger than you want to admit that it is. So I live in Annapolis, Maryland, and there are communities in Annapolis, Maryland that in all of the climate models show will be underwater, and they're very expensive homes. And if you admit that that's a problem, now immediately those homes are uninsurable. And when those homes are uninsurable, then that means the money that's coming into Annapolis, Maryland to fund all of its work, it now disappears because the property taxes are going to go down. So there's a desire, or human nature is don't, as soon as we admit that this is a problem as big as it really is, we are, I'm going to not use the word that I was thinking of, but we're making things way harder for ourselves than they need to be. So how can we govern our way through this? We need institutions that are able to think beyond those restrictions that local governments have. And so one of the things, and by the way, this has been done across the United States for generations as it relates to infrastructure and how we finance infrastructure. And we give institutional authority and the ability to think about the resources and infrastructure they're managing from outside of the normal political risk and think about it from a financial and a physical risk perspective. We do it with drinking water, we do it with wastewater, we do it with stadiums, we do it with metro systems. And that's where we see climate and resilience needing to go. And we're starting to see it happen in a few places. It's happening in Maryland. Massachusetts is doing some really interesting work, moving these ideas along. Connecticut's done some amazing work in this area, but it's allowing these new institutions to think more like money needs to think and about what the problem really is and not be constrained politically because it's just too hard for politicians to think past those barriers that I identified. So and I just want to make just a quick comment. You didn't ask this question, but I'm going to answer it anyway.
Go ahead.
The role of the federal government. First of all, I think especially all three of you, the primary role, it seems to me, of the federal government is to protect human lives in disasters like this. And that's the real tragedy, it seems to me, of what's happening in this administration is just putting real lives at risk if this system is not functioning the right way. But the optimist in me, and it's a very small part of me, but it's in there, is that there's also this role for innovation. You are correct that not everybody's going to be able to respond, but what choice do we have? If we don't reduce all the carbon, what choice do we have but to adapt and to respond? And I think it's the federal government's job to invest in innovation. And every time there's a disaster like this, to learn from that disaster and literally get the marketplace to move in the right direction. And I think these governance models, more innovative public-private type relationships could result in that type of innovation. I have to think that way, or else it is just a little bit too difficult to comprehend.
Great, thanks. Derek and Garrett, I want to give you a chance to just weigh in on that briefly. As I mentioned, improved governance and financing design is such a key piece of the hub and our thinking going forward. What are your thoughts as the locals begin to think through their structures and their design, governance and oversight going forward? What are some thoughts you might have on that?
So first, I've had the, I guess, fortune of working at the federal, state, and local level in emergency management and hazard mitigation, doing disaster risk reduction work. And I think, I sympathize with that sense that we are actually, we're at a confluence of crises. In addition to the climate-driven change, we also have reached the end of the useful life of most of the public infrastructure in this country, and that public infrastructure was not built by state and local dollars. But it was built by federal dollars as well. It was built in a different time, a time of growth. It was built in a time when the cost of building infrastructure was substantially less than it is today. And so I think there's a lot of interesting finance models, and I really appreciated the examples. But I am worried that the dollars are not actually the problem here. The problem is we are bad administrators. We don't know how to build projects. At FEMA, when I looked at the amount of money that I had from my grant. So I ran BRIC, I ran HMGP, I ran flood mitigation assistance, I ran the floodplain management regulatory programs. And when I looked at the programs that we ran for the grant side, I was taking 10% to manage for my people to manage the grants. Then the states were taking 10% to manage the grants. then the locals were taking 5% to manage the grants. Every single year, I was losing maybe 5% of the value due to inflation. It takes at least 2 years for many of these grants to get awarded. And then I have easy 10% overhead from doing just ridiculous environmental historic preservation reviews. Like historic preservation reviews on a tear down rebuild of a single house, right? Takes a year. It's ridiculous, clearly ridiculous. And when you look at all of that and you realize that you're spending somewhere between 35 and 50% of every single dollar on administrative overhead, and that American cost of infrastructure development for almost all sectors, I think except highways, are simply higher than everywhere else in the world, you say, it doesn't matter how much money we have because we simply cannot build the thing. I think that the real innovation that we need beyond, because there's a lot of really interesting climate finance innovation out there in the rest of the world where they haven't had the federal government doing it for them, including in countries like Australia, including in countries like places like Taiwan, like places where you have extremely interesting infrastructure finance models, and it's very exciting. Barbados has done some amazing work on infrastructure finance because they have to. So when I look at this, I think the innovation we really need from a governance standpoint is we need to become better administrators of these programs. And what that means is really a shift in the way we administer programs, again, focusing on that outcome-oriented mindset, adopting we've all heard of zero-based budgeting, adopt zero-based program design approaches, where you look at every single layer of program design through the lens of how that additional element of design will affect outcomes. If you want to know how to do it wrong, unfortunately, you look at I was only at FEMA 2 years. I did not design BRIC myself, but you look at the fact that they focus first on prioritization, on regulation, on rules, on review cycles, on the establishment of panels, on how the points were going to be allocated. That's what everybody cared about. That's not that's not how the projects get built. And frankly, the only thing that generates success is success. It's the actually seeing the success. And I know that we have tremendous power to drive that success. I'll give one brief example that is actually from the insurance space. So on my resume, it says that I undertook the largest regulatory enforcement action in FEMA history, and I'm very proud of that, when I put Fort Myers Beach on probation from the National Flood Insurance Program. And the reason I could do that was because of Hurricane Ida and our failure to put New York City on probation and kill all those people in those basement apartments. So my staff wrote an email that we sent to the administrator before the meeting that said the consequences of non-enforcement is people drowning in their basements, families drowning in their basements. So when we went up to decide on an election year, before the election, that we were going to put Fort Myers Beach on probation, we said, this is a life and death scenario. And we were able to point to what the consequences of non-enforcement. So Fort Myers Beach shows up in my office after the election and tells me that they're going to stick Byron Donalds on me, which is frightening. I was pretty sure I was going to lose my job that day. Brief digression. My staff had scheduled the meeting in person with no FEMA lawyers or government affairs people, so I was by myself, and I thought, this is it. This is it. I've got twins on the way, and this is it. And so in this meeting, they said, you have to help us. You have to take us off probation. I expected them to be mad because of the 25% increase in premiums that they experienced from losing their community rating system class. No, it was probation. Despite the fact they could still sell insurance, the mere threat of potential suspension from the NFIP had destroyed their housing market completely. It had ground to a halt. They couldn't sell a house. They had hundreds and hundreds of properties stacking up on this barrier island community on the coast of Florida that they couldn't sell because they were on probation from the NFIP. So why does this excite me? Because we actually do have tremendous incentive power in the way that we insure things, the kinds of things that we choose to fund from an innovation standpoint. I think you make a really good point. But we do need to focus on actually administering these programs as they're intended to be administered. That means that we've got to keep the outcome in focus on the grant side. And that means that we have to keep the risk and resilience kind of enforcement in focus on the code standards, land use, and insurance side. If you do those things from a governance standpoint, I know that change is possible. And how do we know change is possible? I think because there's plenty of places in this country. Look at Tulsa, Oklahoma, class 1 community rating system community that has largely addressed its flooding problem since the 1980s. They did that through sustained effort over decades, and they have been able to fix a lot of their problems. And so I do think that globally, this is an unsolvable problem. I think locally it's often solvable, but you got to get the administration right, and you've got to use the tools in your toolbox.
Thanks, Derek. Garrett, anything you wanted to add on governance and finance design?
Just to echo some of the thoughts from the other two panelists, there's been a lot of discussion lately on the issues that Derek's talking about why it's so hard to build in this country. If anyone wants to read Abundance by Ezra Klein, it tackles this issue, and I really think it's central to the point here. It's not just about resilience per se, but being able to build capital projects, in the U.S. and in particular parts of the U.S. Especially. I think that when you look at some of the mitigation programs that exist, and when I say mitigation, I know there's terminology confusion sometimes. We're talking about resilience, right? Reducing risk for damage and loss of life. It's been a mixed bag of success, and projects have taken a long time because of a whole combination of factors, including burdensome grant application processes and environmental review processes, which are not always super efficient, and then just long construction timetables that result in cost overruns, which result in changing eligibility, which result in financing gaps that have to be addressed. So I think that's a really good point. Reducing regulation in certain ways, perhaps if you're talking about resilience projects that are designed and are based on proven methodologies, which should reduce risk and should combat the effects of climate change. Going through the same review as you would for a petroleum plant seems unnecessary. Getting a little more micro, I think, at a local level, breaking down silos between agencies, championing projects from start to finish, going through a prioritization process that really elevates the best and most shovel-ready projects, makes a lot of sense. And I think the idea that local government shouldn't be necessarily working towards eligibility of projects for various programs, but starting with kind of what the outcomes they want to achieve in recovery and resilience, and then finding the programs and financing that work to achieve those goals. So I think those are all important points.
Thanks, Garrett. Appreciate it. Dan, want to turn back to you as we've talked a little bit about the evolving role at the federal level and states and pivoting now to local communities and governance structures. Can talk a little bit about how can climate resilience successfully include community perspective and local context, really focused on them to ensure their successful implementation?
Sure. First of all, I just want to say hang in there, because when you get to be my age and your kids are gone, the fear of being fired is like, whatever. Doesn't matter anymore.
I admire that.
Right.
Would that were my twins. Did I not find we were having twins at the beginning of February?
Right.
At the worst possible moment.
No, absolutely. No, there's never a good moment in twins. I'm just saying it gets better the older you get. So what was the question again?
Yeah, so down to the local level, climate resilience successfully including community perspectives and that local
Yeah,
context.
Sure. And I'm, as you may, I don't know if this has become clear with my comments, my focus really is on the resilience and adaptation side. And how communities finance that. And by the way, one thing we've not even brought up yet is where the real money is. And I would agree, it's not all about money, but that's in the market and the private sector. That's where this is really being driven. And the government's responding to that or not responding, as the case may be in certain situations. So, and that's been a big focus of mine is on from resilience. How do we move capital where it needs to be? I actually agree with you completely. It's not about money, except that it's entirely about money. It is about efficiency, and it is about, and you are right, we can't build the way we used to build. And part of the concern I have with not this conversation, but the broader conversations is we are expecting to solve this problem that is almost impossible for our brains to comprehend with the same systems that we used that got us into this situation in the first place. And so what is Einstein's definition of an idiot? You know, you keep doing the same thing over and over and expect a different result. And I just don't think we can do that. So go back to these governance systems at the local level. We have to incentivize entirely new ways for them to think about what can be done and how they're going to solve this problem. So with the emergency management issue, you have, my understanding is the four components, right? So it's mitigate, prepare, respond, and recover. The middle two are much more, and I say this without any aspersions, those are more formulaic, right? It's FEMA and the system for dollars and who's responsible. And as you said, rightfully so, a very frightening thought, which is responsibility without authority. You know, that's a terrible place to, I think that's how you said it, but it still is a bummer of a place to be. But the two on the other side are much more local, right? The resilience and what you do on the ground, what you're trying to protect, what you're trying to be, what's being resilient, what is the community going to look like, what do you want that community to be, and then the opportunity you have, and quite honestly, we call it the opportunity resilience, but the opportunity of disaster. And it is there, right? You start over and you have a way of rebuilding your community that is better. You can put the buildings in place that give you that 1:11 ratio that come in, and that's very community based. The formulas for what works in New York City are different than what works in Nashville, North Carolina. It's a different place, it's a different culture, it's a different community that's trying to protect itself. The problem that I've had with the finance and the investment is that we like to aggregate. We want things to be, we don't like change. If it changes, the interest rate goes through the roof. If it's risky, the interest rates goes through the roof. And so we try to aggregate every community to be the same, and which is why, by the way, the private sector doesn't sit in these meetings very often, because it's like, well, what happens in that community needs to be the same in that community. Why insurance companies are leaving, because to them, it's all aggregated into one place. So the local level, it is about the money and it's about them building their system. And I actually agree that we can do it if the federal government is in a support system at the locally driven initiatives and the financing and investment, and not the other way around. And right now it's the other way around. And I think that's what's getting us into trouble. And I think that we're saying the same thing, that those federal programs got to run the right way. And to me, they don't run the right way when you're expecting the money to filter down. It's not going to work.
Thanks, Dan. Derek, how would you describe from your experience a place-based solution?
So, first of all, as a guy who's been against federal, state, and local, mitigation is fundamentally place-based. I found it very confusing when we were all talking about place-based at FEMA, and I thought, what do you mean? That's not what we were doing this whole time? For me, I guess I'd describe it most of all as something that is actually not just built with the locals in mind, but a product that's designed and built, that's designed as though somebody is actually supposed to use it. So if you think about technology companies, and you think about the product design and development process of technology companies that create profoundly addictive things for our children and ourselves, and you think about why they're effective and their process of feature rollouts and how they view us as kind of customers that get it for free, but then they find other ways of monetizing us. And then we think, well, you look at these grant programs and we run them like charities. You should be grateful that I'm giving you this money and making you spend all this time and doing all this work. So protect your people. Well, that's ridiculous, because first of all, in order to achieve national policy aims of resilience, we need these people at the local level to actually implement this stuff. We need them to implement their building codes. they can choose not to, and they don't, and we still pay for them. And so we really need them to buy into the system. If you want people to buy into a system, you've got to have something that is designed to be attractive and accessible and enjoyable for them to use. So when I think place-based, I'm first of all, obviously we're talking about stuff that's built in place. Well, that's every mitigation recovery project is in that and physically in that community. But I think a step beyond that is that every part of the experience, from the first time you hit that application landing page to the last closeout meeting that you have, that is a good experience. Instead of when you first log in with Brick, you realize it's just an application intake module with no backend and no analytics and no project management tool. So you cannot even know where your application is in the pipeline. I've been working, so at AECOM, we've got our program management capability, which is really kind of the biggest thing that we do, but from the side of the sector that I'm in. But what's really exciting about the work I get to do now is I'm helping some states think through how to develop their own programs. And the things I'm telling them is that to be effective, first, you've got to actually have somebody there to answer the phone and help a customer like you would a proper customer. Second, technology is necessary from the very beginning because you don't add in the technology and tools later. And third, you have a project management tool that can help you actually tell people where the status of their project is, tell people where in the pipeline things are. The key to actual place-based administration of these programs is getting the money in its place. So sorry, that sounds a little bit of that's a weird truism, but it's getting the money visible on the ground. So final example, I built a ArcGIS dashboard at FEMA, and I put all the Brick money on it, and I sent it to the Congresspeople's office so they could look at it and stop asking us all the time, where's the projects here? And I had the status of that project in very general terms. They loved it because for once they could actually see impact and see what these dollars actually meant for people. It meant that Tom Cole was willing to speak up and defend. He's a North Carolina, Oklahoma representative. Was willing to speak up and say something positive about Brick when the program got sort of canceled this spring. The act of turning the money from being a big amorphous program that is just generic into something that is actually affecting somebody on the ground really was what mattered. Washington State, where I came from, this meant that the North Shore Levee, a $100 million project that's meant to protect over 3,000 homes and businesses in an economically impoverished coastal community, was not going to happen. And it was 2 or 3 weeks from obligation when the program got canceled. That made it place-based. We actually knew where the money went. We knew what it was building, and we knew who was going to suffer because it wasn't. If we keep everything high level, and we keep treating these things like some kind of charity thing that you can come asking for a handout instead of treating it like something that's designed to accomplish a national priority that we need the locals to do, we won't achieve a true place-based impact.
Thanks, Derek. I'm going to ask one more question, but we are turning to the point in time where we're going to turn to you all and to those online for Q&A. So be thinking about that. We'll be interested in any questions that you have. I'm going to open it up here, Garrett, to you on public-private partnerships. How can community and private partnerships be leveraged to enhance climate resilience and adaptation efforts?
Well, I think it's important to note that a lot of the critical infrastructure is privately owned, right? So when you're talking about mitigating or building resilience, you can't just talk about public buildings or publicly owned infrastructure. So the private sector has got to be involved. I mean, utilities, many are privately owned, and they're absolutely critical to resilience. So I think I wanted to bring up an example which I think ties together some of these things. Sometimes when there's a disaster, and this has been alluded to on the panel, when there's a disaster that really devastates a community, decision makers and community members start to be able to think a little more creatively about what they can do, as opposed to kind of rebuilding in place or just thinking about, okay, we have we have a certain amount of grant money we can access for for recovery. So in Panama City, after Hurricane Michael, I mean, this community was truly devastated. I think 90% of the public infrastructure was damaged or destroyed, and something like 70% of the housing. So this is wiped out basically. And the process that this community went through to sort of reimagine what Panama City could be, I think was really instructive. You know, this conversation and planning process involved, residents, community organizations, businesses, and the political leadership as well at multiple levels. And what you got was a real plan that represented, I think, basically the will of the people, and it was tied to funding from a variety of sources, federal government, HUD, FEMA. There were tax credits and tax abatement programs. There was private investment because private sector saw opportunities as well. And this is still an unfinished story, right? The rebuilding continues, but there's been tremendous progress, and I think it's instructive to think about how it's not just about government; it's about everybody. And I think the results are going to be pretty outstanding, and that's because this disaster freed people up to think outside of the box of just, okay, now I'm applying for FEMA public assistance or hazard mitigation grant program funding. So I think that's just an example of how private and public can work together for recovery and resilience.
Absolutely. Thank
Can
you.
I just
hit
quick
it.
response to that? I think it's important to remember that no government builds anything. The private sector builds everything. Now, there's probably some. It's just more fun to speak in absolutes, but I'm willing to bet.
Some nuances in there is what we're saying.
But I'm willing to bet that that's 99% true, right? You contract out, you don't build the road yourself. You have companies that build the road. So the whole infrastructure development process in our country has been a public-private partnership from the beginning. But when we talk about public-private partnerships, we're usually referring to a new way of not just building, but assuming risk for the building and the operations, maintenance, and management of that system. That's really what P3s are about, and they've been used very successfully across many different infrastructure systems. We use them in transportation all the time. By the way, you are absolutely correct. We will never build highways the way we built them in the Eisenhower system. Now, unless that road pays for itself, it's going to be very difficult to get it put on the ground, and if it pays for itself, it's going to be a P3. That's how it's going to work. We see this all the time in water, wastewater. It's been done a lot. Increasingly, stormwater, if you want a really interesting example, just our neighbor here, Prince George's County, Maryland, has a fascinating P3 system that they put in place for their regulated stormwater system. It's not based on the drainage or flooding system. And that's where I think, going back to the governance systems and at the local level, that's what I was referring to. It's more of these conversations about what role will the private sector in the market play, how will they help assume risk, and then how will that reduce the cost, create efficiency, improve the quality of the product we're putting on the ground, and hopefully get at the issue you were talking about, which is the cost of building this infrastructure in our country is just too great. And I think part of the reason is, again, how we engage that market. So I just want to make it clear that how we engage the private sector is a different question than how public-private partnerships are going to work. And they're related, but they're kind of unique issues.
Got it. Thanks, Dan. Okay, we're there. We're going to open it up to questions. Feel free to raise your hand. We have a microphone in the room so that those in the room and online can hear. I saw Louis' hand go up first, and then we'll go from there. It's coming.
Great conversation. 2014, I was at a conference up in Canada, and they flew in somebody from England, probably Lloyd's of London. And he started his talk by saying the insurance company would drive the solution set to climate change. I'm thinking now of Florida and California, possibly. And he gave as an example the big crisis at the turn of the last century, which was cities were burning down because there was no zoning between the industrial base the housing base, and they refused to do it. So the insurance companies came in some way. Now, I never went back and looked up the details, but they basically said, if you don't rezone, we're not insuring anything you rebuild, and that stopped everything. I was just curious, we've seen in Florida a real perturbation to the insurance industry, and the way they're conducting themselves is having impacts all over the place. Is that following this model, or is that just something completely different in terms of them not wanting to assume any of the risk of this? In other words, they started leaving Florida after
Right.
Andrew, and they seem to accelerate with every disaster. So I was just curious, is that a true statement that, by the insurance company playing this, they could actually drive a solution set of how it's rebuilt at the local level, or not?
Dan, do you want to chime in on that?
Well, yeah, yes, but it will be a very painful lesson if we don't do it the right way. By the way, let's not even bring up Florida, because their insurer of last resort, like most states, is the state, and how they finance that system is fascinating, and we'll leave it at that. I mentioned that, if you talk to a lot of insurance experts, they'll tell you that we have a climate bubble getting ready to happen, which means that there are a lot of these properties that I referred to before that are assessed very high, which local governments rely on for their vast majority of local governments across the country rely on property taxes. And the bubble is that the insurance companies are going to be like, no, we're not doing this anymore. So we've already seen it. We've already seen them pulling out, and it's very difficult to insure a lot of coastal regions and fire regions without subsidizing that insurance somehow. So there's going to be some type of relationship between states, local governments, and insurance companies. The reason I said it was going to be painful is that, honestly, it seems to me in certain places this is entirely market driven by the insurance companies, and they're just going to pull. They're under no obligation. So back in the day, there were so few urban places that they could insure. They had to step in, or they were going to lose market. That's not the case anymore. There's all kinds of things that they do. They can move their money in different ways that they never were able to do before. So yes, but it's going to look very different than it did back in the day when Lloyd's London was doing these types of things. But I would suggest, by the way, you're correct. Insurance companies have to be sitting at the table for this conversation. We're missing the big federal agency that should be sitting at the table is DOD. They know more about their assets and what's going on in this issue than probably many of the other agencies. Going back to Florida, there's a third, and everybody's going to probably laugh at me when I say this, but if you don't engage the homeowners associations, you're not going to solve this problem. If you look at what's happening in Florida, where everybody thought they were on a fixed income and this is what their mortgage was going to be, and all of a sudden their HOA fee went to like 4 times what their mortgage is, and now they're priced out of their homes. If we don't talk to HOAs, those are the 3 industries that I think are going to be part of it. So the answer is yes, but if you have a home on the Outer Banks, don't wait for the insurance industry to innovate in time to protect your home. Is probably
Very briefly example, Fortified program in Alabama and Louisiana.
Yeah.
It is a fantastic public-private partnership. Between the state and insurers, the reason it works is because it's good product design. You've got a clear calculation that communities can do, so people understand that engage the builders. The builders know how to build the thing. They engage the homeowners at the state level. They use the power of the state and the power of the insurers to engage homeowners with really clear instructions on what you got to do. And there's a calculator that shows what your benefits are going to be. There's some programs from the state that help finance these investments. Should a state invest in this? Because housing is an infrastructure. Yeah, the current owners benefit, but the future owners for the next 50 years also benefit, and you need that housing. Right. They also use implementers, like they've got nonprofit implementers that help kind of do the evangelizing, engage with the building industry, and that can work. But again, I would argue it's not any one industry that's driving it. The group I'd add to your 3 is the builders. I think
correct.
We've considered them to be enemies for a really long time, because they don't want to do the obvious thing to us, which is build more resilient housing. I think they might have a point when they say that every 3 years building code updates is too soon. It's hard to train people. It's hard to implement something like that. maybe there's a compromise we need to get to with that industry to make resilience a premium product that people actually want to buy.
More houses left standing, one of those are city, all rebuilt with the
Yeah.
So
We're going to see a lot more round homes, by the way, in
Yeah.
Florida. Right.
those are difficult to buy furniture for.
They are. Yes.
Thank
Yeah.
you both. Over here next.
Essentially asked my questions.
Okay.
So,
All right.
but maybe I'll give you a chance to go a little deeper into your answers because I think the insurance crisis is real and it can be a catalyst to address some of the issues you've been talking about. I'm Solomon Green, Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, formerly the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Research at HUD, where the insurance crisis permeated everything we did in the housing space. I mean, it's a supply issue, it's a preservation issue, it's a climate issue, it's an economic issue. And when we were at HUD and even across the federal family, we could kind of throw our hands up because insurance is a state and local, insurers are regulated at the state and local level. There actually wasn't a lot we can do. And so my more pointed question, because I think your response fortifies maybe a little bit getting to the answer, but your response was, we can't expect insurers to save us. That's not their job. I agree. But what are some of the state and local policy hooks? Because what I'm seeing is you're either going to just over-regulate the insurers, and because of their kind of footless, might go wherever we're going to have a profit, may not be a successful strategy, or create public insurance models rather than focusing on what we talked about earlier, which is to make communities more secure, resilient, and insurable. So what do you think some really promising state and local resiliency models are that could address the insurance crisis?
Well, that last question was very different than what you were asking the rest of it. I don't know. I haven't found any yet when it comes to the insurance crisis, but I think you're on to something, which is that right now it's like an either or. You either have the market that's insuring, the private insurance markets, or you have the states are backstopping and saying, okay, if you can't get it anywhere else, we have a system where you can get it. Doesn't seem to me, and I'm not an insurance expert, but I would suggest that just the way that we subsidize insurance right now, instead of doing it through that system, why aren't the states and the insurance companies working together and within the same institutional structures to say, you have your own risk profile, we have a different risk profile. We stack capital like this all the time, and it seems to me this is coming, and I'm sounding like a one-trick pony. It's a governance issue. It's a public-private partnership as it relates to insurance, and we don't do that real well right now, but I think we're going to be forced to. So I think it goes back to your question, will the insurance companies drive this? Yeah, probably, but not, I stand by what I said. It's not their job to protect everybody, but if you somehow work with them and ironically deal with their risk, by the way, it's not just the insurance companies, the reinsurance companies are one that are really driving the train on this one. I think there's a real opportunity there to make to literally from a different institutional model to the state and local level to be able to do that. The concern that I have, actually the opportunity is just what you said, it's not regulated at the federal level. And this is where state and local governments can regionalize in these relationships with the insurance companies and create some efficiency. So that's the hope anyways.
So I've got a couple models that are doing this. City in South Carolina that is looking at identifying the homes that are going to get washed away over the next, couple of decades, to begin, widespread either buyout or mitigation programs. The opportunity that goes beyond this is to do things like buying out a house now, allowing the people to continue to live there until such a time as the house is either destroyed, they choose to move, or they pass. New forms of proactive acquisition in those places that don't make people move right now. There's Elevate Florida, which is a mitigation reconstruction program driven by the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and Flood Mitigation Assistance Swift Current, which was an innovation from my team a couple of years ago that really sped up for us the dollars. It is possible to speed them up by another 50%. Get projects started within 6 months after a disaster, rebuilding every single house in these places in a resilient way. there isn't a really good excuse, given the availability of dollars after big events, to not. And I would actually argue that big post-disaster investments in housing resilience are the best way are the way we're going to get to resilience, if we're going to get to resilience. And then finally, rating systems. So community rating system has a lot of issues. That's the NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program rating system. It incentivizes stuff that doesn't matter, and that's a problem. However, there's a lot of benefits that we found from community level policies that are not captured at the individual property level policy, like open space policies that protect high flood risk areas, or defensible space policies at the community scale, or policies or requirements that say homes must all be built with certain kinds of roofing. You can make an entire area insurable with a rating system policy, but it's because of this 50-state insurance approach. To my knowledge, with an exception of some California stuff on fire, there's just a lack of investment in the development of rating systems as a tool to preserve insurability. And I think that is an area that we could see some tremendous investment of time in, and partnership with insurance companies, and all that would both incentivize the kind of resilient behavior that we want while keeping these places still coverable.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Dan. Okay, I think we've reached our time here by 2 minutes over. Really appreciate everyone coming today. Please do continue to follow the work of the Extreme Weather Resilience Hub on NAPA's website, but also follow on LinkedIn. Give a round of applause for our panel. Amanda.
Thank you all for coming today. This has been an excellent convening. Thank you all for being in the room. I'm going to have to stand in front of you awkwardly because apparently I'm not on the video. So we at the Academy are focused on making government more efficient, effective, accountable, and transparent. And I think a lot of the ideas that we heard today will do just that. This is really an opportunity for us to be better administrators of our programs. I heard Derek Hebert emphasize that, given his experience at FEMA. This is really an opportunity to reimagine the system as a whole. And I heard a lot of suggestions and ideas and thoughts, and you all have those as well. So part of the hub is building a network, getting people together from all sectors, private, public, all levels of government, to come up with what are the solutions that we can have to this thing. Just lastly, want to thank the Academy staff. This wouldn't have happened without all of you, Miles Murphy, Erica Cintron, Lizzie Alwan, Ren Williams, and others. This is fantastic. Just thank you all so much. And then the last thing, you all talked about insurance and set up our next event very well. So we are partnering with Leadership Connect later on October 23rd at 2 o'clock to have an event where we discuss all of the insurance-based challenges that they just all set up for us right now. So this is great. Please follow us on our website. Stay in touch. This is the start of what I hope to be many more successful events. And just thank you everyone for coming.